when purchasing rental property, is it the first, second, third, etc.? When is it advisable to purchase in a corporate name versus a personal name?
I'm not as concerned whether you're at number 0, 1, 2, or 18. I'm much more concerned about where do you plan on being. And so we will have people set up corporations even before they've acquired their first property, assuming that they're starting to actively hunt down target properties. Admittedly, some of these costs are exasperated in certain provinces compared to others, but if we have somebody in Ontario, for example, let's pick Toronto, where they've got, for those people, for example, in Alberta, you don't have the privilege of paying land transfer tax. Whereas if you're from Toronto, not only you get to pay land transfer tax, but you effectively pay twice the land transfer tax that others get to pay in Ontario. And so other provinces have and territories have their own regimes, and not everybody's got the land transfer tax, but all of a sudden, if you're paying, roughly speaking, 4% in terms of transfer taxes, and we bought, let's keep the number simple, $1 million property, and now we want to move it to a corporation, I mean, the lawyer and accounting fees for doing that transfer are cheap compared to the land transfer taxes. And so all of it, however, was completely non-value added in the sense of how do we set up the corporation in the first place with a thought process we were going to need it. We could have avoided all of those costs. And so again, it doesn't take too many transactions for that more than made sense. Even if we're underutilizing that corporation for a couple of years while we put a few more properties into it, using my example, that by the time you're done with legal and accounting, let's say it was 50 grand to move that property, my financial statements are nowhere near that cost. So just saving that 50 grand probably is going to pay for my financial statements, particularly if you can invest some of the money. I mean, for years and years and years and years. It's the math is a no-brainer.
What is the benefit of incorporating? Why would somebody get a corporation?
There's actually multiple benefits, and I like to classify them in different categories. The other thing too, I think, with that is to keep in mind, different investors will have or place different levels of importance on the different factors. So I kind of start off with what I call flexibility. And flexibility means if I buy a property personally in my name, it is what it is, in the sense of now once a year, I'm going to add up all the rental income, take off the expenses. I get popped onto my tax return. It's really, really straightforward. I didn't have, if I had, in contrast to a corporation, the ability to decide what year would I like to pay tax on that personally. How would I like to pay tax, in the sense of, do I want a dividend? Do I want a bonus, a wage? Do I want a temporary loan? Do I want something else? If I've got family members, do I have other family members that own a portion of that corporation? Who am I going to pay amongst the family members? In terms of adding or subtracting shareholders, much easier to do as compared to if I own that property personally. So flexibility is one. Two is legal matters. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but it doesn't take much of a rocket scientist to do a little research and know that many lawyers prefer to have a corporation for a property for liability reasons. Whether that's what your lawyer is going to advise, I mean, that's between you and the lawyer, effectively. The third part is taxes. In many cases, contrary to popular belief, the corporation can be much cheaper from a tax perspective. I mentioned earlier in terms of people focusing on what the taxes are today. And so often people get focused on the idea that, again, depending on the province or territory we're referring to, if we have long-term rental income, typically that initial tax rate for the corporation, the key word there being initial, is about 50%, 50. And if I compare that with personal tax brackets, well, it's going to depend on how much income that individual or the family has. And so a lot of the real estate investors are really going to be kind of between, say, 30 and a touch over 50% in terms of a personal tax bracket. So somebody that's getting closer and closer to 50 on that the personal side, they're really not going to notice much of a difference one way or the other. Some of the provinces, that personal rate is higher than the corporate rate. So the corporation provides more of incentive there, but they have to be at a pretty good tax bracket. The thing that most people are forgetting is that that corporate bracket is 50% initially. But if I pay out a dividend to a qualified shareholder, I get a 30% refund. So now my corporate tax rate's 20%. Now I have to see what's the taxes on the personal side. And again, as a quick example, if I pay a dividend of roughly $40,000, I'm paying about $1,000 in taxes, depending on which province and territory we're talking about. And where I kind of get towards the $100,000, I'm about 15 grand or so in taxes. So all of that's to say, let's stop focusing on what that day one tax rate is and focus on what the tax rate's going to be over the years. And even if I have to front end that 50% corporate tax, I'm accumulating the 30% year over year. I'm keeping track of it. Maybe for 10 years, I keep paying into it. But then I start getting it refunded because I've retired, I've semi-retired. My spouse says, maybe I've got adult children I can get dividends to. And now I've got this huge amount of reserve that can come out. Or I say, hey, Corey, Tiffany, I've got these properties in a corporation. Why not, instead of you buying the real estate, you buy my corporation? By the way, there's $2 million of refundable taxes there. Why don't we split that? So sooner or later, if it's in the corporation, I am going to somehow get some of that back, or my family will. If I'm paying 40, 50% tax personally, that money is gone forever. I'm never going to see it again. So again, so I'm not saying the corporation is always better. And if I'm flipping properties, I'm doing rent to owns, there's some other techniques a little bit more elaborate. I can get that tax rate down to around 25%, in some cases 12-ish, 10%. So again, there's more opportunities there. Third thing we kind of look at, going back to the reasons to incorporate, is the financing. And certainly some individuals are going to find it more difficult to get funding through the corporation. We find if we're talking to people that know what they're doing on the funding side, they're usually going to find it much easier to get the funding. But I don't deny you can go to any major financial institution and find people there that absolutely positively have no idea how to get the funding. And you can go to that same institution and talk to somebody else, and they have no idea how you couldn't get it as long as you did it the right way. The last thing we look at is, in terms of that corporation, I'll call it the organization and the professional aspect. So if we're dealing with other investors, if we're dealing with professionals, tradespeople, etc., do you want that image of the corporation, or do you want the image of working out of the back of the pickup to do the work, if you will? Now, all of those 5 areas that we talk about, they could point to one direction or the other, and different people or different families may have identical fact situations, but we come to different conclusions because they place more importance on legal, for example, compared to something else. And I'm not trying to say somebody's right or wrong. It's just to say we need to evaluate that and figure out what's right for that particular family.
Yeah. So it is different depending on who you're talking to, right? And that's why having a chat with an accountant, sitting down with George or someone on George's team, now all of a sudden you can plan for the future. You can have a strategy. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to make a corporation, or I'm not, et cetera, et cetera. So awesome.